Yes, it's always encouraging to come down and speak before the Martin Center, and I had the privilege of first speaking about the Goldwater Model Campus Free Speech Bill at a Martin Center event, and then North Carolina became the first state to enact that into law. So I have a lot of good feelings about the Martin Center in North Carolina. Okay, so in April of 2016, a wave of panic swept over the campus of Indiana University at Bloomington. Students began sending out warning tweets. Quote, "IU students, be careful. There is someone walking around in KKK gear with a whip." End quote. A resident hall assistant, Ethan Gill, sent out an urgent email amplifying the many warnings. Quote, "There has been a person reported walking around campus in a KKK outfit, holding a whip. Because the person is protected under First Amendment rights, the IU Police Department cannot remove this person from campus unless an act of violence is committed. Please, please, please," all caps, "be careful out there tonight. Always be with someone. If you have no dire reason to be out of the building, I would recommend staying indoors if you're alone," end quote. When this dangerous intruder was finally spotted, snacking at a frozen yogurt store just off campus, it became evident that he was in fact a monk, wearing the traditional white habit of the Dominican order. His supposed whip was a long string of rosary beads hanging down his leg. This was Father Jude McPeak, a Dominican friar and campus minister at Indiana University's Catholic Center. Instead of hunting for minorities to flay, Father McPeak was whipping up a vanilla and dark chocolate froyo mix with coconuts and peanuts on top. Now, it seems to me that this little story tells us exactly where we are today. In the first place, of course, we have straightforward ignorance. There was a time when students, from elite universities to community colleges and everywhere in between, were required to study the history and great ideas of Western civilization in order to graduate. Even accounting for the occasional slacker and for ordinary forgetfulness, too many students decades ago would have known what a monk was to have allowed such a rumor to proliferate. But there's something more than simple ignorance at work here. A new and ostensibly secular worldview that dominates our universities. In this view, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation are signposts of reverence. See, beads in a postmodern rosary, so to speak. In this postmodern vision of the sacred, the faithful adopt an attitude of perpetual vigilance for any sign, whether within themselves or in others, of bias or bigotry by race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. Now, it's easy enough to find such prejudice in the past, of course, but the new worldview's distinctive claim is that the open prejudice of earlier eras lives on in disguised fashion here and now. Today's bias is more difficult to perceive, perhaps, but is alleged to be diffused throughout our institutions, pervading every aspect of the social fabric. Bigotry, we're told, is institutional and systemic. Now, the mysterious nature of this supposedly systemic bigotry leads us to perpetually scour our souls and the souls of others for hatred and bias that may be difficult to find, but surely must be there. And yet this strange postmodern doctrine leaves its followers thirsty for something more solid and incontestable, It produces a yearning to recapture the perfect moral righteousness of an earlier time. Some have dubbed the phenomenon Selma envy, the desire for a perfect dragon of bigotry to slay, and the need to invent such a dragon if he doesn't exist. A yearning to bring the heroic struggle for civil rights into the present. A need to prove beyond doubt that despite all appearances, nothing of significance has changed since 1965. That our nation, our tradition, our institutions are stained and deeply flawed, and that only the righteous among us can correctly perceive and oppose this. That's what we saw at the University of Indiana at Bloomington in 2016. Disguised as fear, we saw a yearning for the moral clarity of an era long gone. We saw a new secular religion, blind to the religions of old. Can you hear? Can you hear well? Good. Okay. I'll return to Selma envy and the battle for the modern university when I take up the issues of anti-Semitism and the restoration of classic general education in the second half of this talk. But right now, I want to return to those long-forgotten Dominicans. I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I take you very briefly back to school. No pop quiz, don't worry about that. It's just that the Dominican order turns out to have played a central role in traditional Western civilization courses. So I'd like to show you how following the thread of this now obscure topic gets us to some of the deeper questions raised by a course on Western civilization. The Dominicans are central to the story of the High Middle Ages, a period that acted as a kind of precursor to the glorious Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. There was an intellectual renaissance in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the Dominicans were at the heart of it. Towns were developing, a literate middle class was coming into existence, and many of these newly sophisticated lay people were attracted to heresies like that of the Cathars, also called Albigensians. Our sources for the Cathar heresy are thin, but Cathars seem to have opposed both marriage and procreation. Urban sophisticates opposed to marriage and procreation. Who would have thought it? The church addressed this challenge with two new orders. The Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi, later to become St. Francis, and the Dominicans, founded by Dominic de Guzman, later to become St. Dominic. In contrast to the existing Christian orders, which had grown decadent or were focused at best on the salvation of the individual monk, Francis practiced a holy poverty and devoted himself to alleviating the sufferings of others. Francis was also a mystic who saw God reflected in nature. St. Dominic was different. He organized his order for the specific purpose of out-arguing and out-persuading the heretical Cathars in the towns. So although the Dominicans, like the Franciscans, were austere and devout, it was the Dominicans, after all, who popularized the rosary. The Dominicans were singularly focused on study. This led the Dominicans to set up schools. The great medieval poet Dante, for example, was educated at a Dominican school. And early on, Dominicans became the leading theologians and philosophers at that most consequential innovation of the High Middle Ages, the university. The two greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages, Albertus Magnus and his pupil, the great Thomas Aquinas, were both Dominicans and taught at the University of Paris. Aquinas, of course, is famous for synthesizing the philosophy of Aristotle with Catholic theology, a synthesis regarded to this day as the most profound and definitive statement of Catholic doctrine. Unsurprisingly, the more mystical strain of medieval thought was carried forward not by the Dominicans, but by the Franciscans. Okay, now this much you will learn from a standard textbook of Western civilization. I've drawn this brief summary from William McNeill's textbook for the University of Chicago's famous Western Civ course, and from Edward McNall Burns's textbook, which was used for Stanford University's popular Western Civ course during the 1950s. Students back then, while pursuing their reading, were of course likely to see a picture of St. Thomas Aquinas wearing the same white Dominican habit worn by Father McPeak of Indiana today, although Aquinas' portraits have his white habit covered at the shoulders by a black mantle. But of course, the textbooks and their illustrations only set the scene for the deeper work of a Western civilization course, which was to explore great literature, philosophy, and original historical documents as a way of unpacking the textbook narrative. A typical Western Civ course, for example, would deepen the story of the Dominicans by exploring issues like heresy, democracy, and the birth of the university, all with original sources. When studying the Dominicans, for example, teachers would typically assign Bernard Guy's, that's G-U-I, Bernard Guy's Manual of the Inquisitor, a Dominican guidebook to the interrogation of Cathar heretics. Yes, it was the Dominicans who operated the dreaded Inquisition, precisely because of their facility with theological study. Now here we can say with justice that the traditional Western civilization course refused to paint an unblemished picture of history. They taught the good with the bad. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but it's also a bit too simple to just call heresy hunting bad and leave it at that. In the sweep of world history, there's nothing particularly surprising about the powers that be in a given society enforcing an orthodoxy. That's how it's always been. The real question is, what changed? How did a society that allows for different opinions on fundamental religious beliefs become possible? The modern, freedom-loving West is the historical anomaly on a world scale in this regard. And that's the real point of a Western civilization course, to trace the development of things like modern liberal democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the development of what we used to call classic liberal education. We won't find the answer to those questions if we treat persecutions of the distant past as simple moral failures measured on a modern scale of values. The real question is why what we now call intolerance seemed to make sense at the time. Was there something more than narrow-mindedness going on? And if so, what changed? What brought tolerance into play? So instead of cringing in embarrassment at Bernard Guy's riveting account, and it's riveting, you can look it up, of his inquisitorial technique, we need to try to make sense of it. If the shoe were on the other foot, for example, and the heretics had the upper hand, would they have been more tolerant of their Dominican inquisitors? There is no good reason to think so. Once you understand how completely the medieval Catholic Church was intermingled with the fundamental institutions of society, political, legal, social, and cultural, it dawns on you that a challenge to the authority of the Church really would have endangered the peace of society. We saw this scenario play out in real life as the Catholic Church gradually lost its singular position, and Protestants and Catholics quite literally went to war. Only after many decades of religious strife did modern liberal democracy begin to emerge as a way of allowing for the peaceful coexistence of conflicting worldviews. By then, society's legal, social, and political institutions were sufficiently disentangled from any one religion and from religious institutions altogether to allow for diverse religious opinions without endangering the social peace. And over the long haul, the Dominicans actually forwarded that movement toward liberal democracy, because at a time when the rest of the church was decidedly hierarchical, Dominicans were organized through a series of elections conducted by secret ballot. Indeed, the Constitution of the Dominican Order, which provided for this system of elections, was often assigned to students taking Western Civ. The founding of universities, a story in which the Dominicans played a leading role, was another major topic of study in the typical Western Civ class. Stanford's course of the 1950s devoted an entire week to the medieval university. Here, students would encounter the same sort of pull and tug between orthodoxy and precursors of modern liberty that we saw in the matter of heresy. On the one hand, Western Civ students read documents itemizing the limits set by the Pope on learning at the new universities. On the other hand, nearly all Western Civ courses included readings from the most renowned Dominican of all, Thomas Aquinas, who tested the orthodoxy of his own day by synthesizing Aristotle with theology. Thomas accommodated Aristotle by drawing a distinction between revealed truth and natural truth, and by treating natural truth as a sphere open to free philosophical and scientific investigation. Ultimately, Thomas's distinction opened the door to the great philosophical and scientific achievements of the West. So we find this mixture in every era. The Dominicans' democratic elections and expansion of intellectual inquiry mixed with the hunting down of heretics. The Protestant Reformation's brilliant openings to freedom of conscience and popular literacy mixed with a still quite traditional attitude toward heresy. The Enlightenment's intellectual breakthroughs blended with a sometimes persecuting hostility to religion. The French Revolution's triumph of liberty and equality mixed with an infamous reign of terror that stands as the prototype of secular political intolerance to this day. The colonial era's spread of democracy, technology, prosperity, and learning mixed with exploitation and the usurpation of self-rule. The extent to which it's possible to disaggregate the good and the bad in all of this can sometimes be difficult to gauge. But certainly the West has made stunning progress. After all, America is long out of the Middle Ages, in case you hadn't noticed. Secular hostility to religion notwithstanding, we are still the land of religious freedom, a freedom supported by no one more enthusiastically than by America's Protestant and Catholic Christians. There's nothing like a tour through Western history to make you appreciate what an extraordinary and singular accomplishment a religious harmony is. Miraculously, and unlike so many other societies around the world to this day, we have found a way to live together in freedom, peace, and prosperity. That's why everyone wants to come here, of course. And that fundamentally is what the Western story is about. At other times, however, deeply ingrained historical patterns appear to permute and repeat without end. The secular leftist orthodoxy of our day, what we now call woke, for example, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the persecuting religious orthodoxies of old. The important thing for our purposes here is the difference between collegians who've had real exposure to Western history on the one hand, and students who in their ignorance have turned the glorious but also complex and sometimes mixed history of the West into a dragon to be slain by the righteous. Studying Western history as it ought to be studied fosters an appreciation for modern liberal democracy with its deep historical roots, its liberating potential, its promotion of peace and prosperity, but also its susceptibility to decline, with freedom, as Reagan said, never more than a generation away from extinction. The respect for the West that emerges from historical study isn't a matter of simplistic cheerleading, which wouldn't work anyway. But students who explore the deep historical roots of freedom of a freedom they revel in, will come to take it far less for granted. Students who see for themselves the intertwining through history of what they admire with human fallibility will reject the shallow pose of moral superiority to the past. And students who read the West's great works of literature and philosophy will be astonished, delighted, and changed. But that is not where we are. We're in a darker place, a simpler place, and frankly, a stupider place. So let's talk about this spring's encampments and what they mean for the United States, the West, and higher education, after which I want to offer a solution of sorts. The first thing to note is that the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstration, encampments, and building takeovers on campus this year were the product of a student political coalition that has existed for decades. Its origins go back to what was then called the Rainbow Coalition at Stanford, inspired by Jesse Jackson's 1984 and 1988 runs for the presidency at the head of what he called his National Rainbow Coalition. It was Jackson's visit to Stanford in 1987 that sparked the famous march at which students chanted, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go." That is, where students demanded elimination of the long-standing requirement in Western civilization. And this, of course, became a catalyst for the elimination of Western civ requirements across the country. The original Stanford Rainbow Coalition consisted of the Black Students Union, a Chicano student group, the Stanford American Indian Organization, the Asian American Students Association, and a group of largely white socialists. Back then, Western culture was actually the most popular course at Stanford, a favorite of around 80% of the student body, many minority students included. But Stanford had far more minority students than most colleges in those days, and a number of those students did object to the Western culture requirement. Now, in those early days, the Rainbow Coalition was fighting for what was widely called multiculturalism. Over time, the number of identity-focused students at Stanford grew. Gradually, the theme of cultural variety was downplayed, sometimes even dropped, in favor of the idea of an intersectional coalition of minority groups and white allies. The coalition now defined itself not as a collection of many cultures, but as an alliance of the marginalized, of groups shut out of power by the color of their skins. From about 2009 on, what's called the People of Color Coalition, with its white allies, has dominated the political and cultural life of Stanford. The People of Color Coalition runs slates of candidates, and they always win for student offices, and they demand rigid adherence to a menu of overlapping causes. Now, Israel has long served as a kind of foil for these groups, proof of sorts that the forces of oppressive power are global in scope. Around 2018, for example, a group called Stanford Out of Occupied Palestine, an intersectional coalition made up of no less than 19 minority-based student organizations, demanded divestment from Israel and charged Israel with three great sins. First, training U.S. police to deal with black people the way its occupation forces deal with Palestinians. Second, permitting religious discrimination against gays. And third, giving technical advice to U.S. immigration enforcement officials based on Israel's experience with its border wall. In short, Israel's alliance with the United States serves to solidify the intersectional coalition by associating the forces of the West with the oppression of all the various intersectional groups. You can see what a useful role Israel plays, since the actual oppression of gays by Muslim countries, or the substantial cultural gulf between, say, Latino Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims could easily pull the intersectional coalition apart. This is likely why the idea of multiculturalism was downplayed or dropped. Too much emphasis on cultural differences actually divides the intersectional coalition. So the idea of multiculturalism was ditched and replaced with the theme of marginalized people of color against the globe-spanning oppressive power of the West. And note that Israel's role as the unifying enemy of the intersectional coalition was established years before the October 7th attacks. Now, the Stanford model of intersectional student coalitions has spread to many campuses. But what about Columbia University, which kicked off this year's pro-Hamas demonstrations? From the perspective of teaching Western civilization and the great books, you might think Columbia University would be the last place to inspire a national movement in support of Hamas and in opposition to Israel and the West. After all, Columbia is one of the very few schools that still requires all of its students to take courses in the great works of Western thought. Well, Ross Douthat of the New York Times looked into the readings for Columbia's famous course on contemporary civilization. What he found is that the readings covering the 20th century and after have changed. They now omit the challenge of totalitarianism, that is, Nazism and communism. They omit economic issues. And of course, they omit any readings by conservatives. The only issues dealt with from the 20th century on are now anti-colonialism, sex and gender, anti-racism, and climate. So Columbia's required readings excoriate the West's history of colonialism and argue that, in fact, if not in name, Western colonial domination has never truly disappeared. Douthat concludes that as a culturally Western country, Israel now serves as a scapegoat for the sins of old European empires and white supremacist regimes of the recent past, like South Africa and Rhodesia. In Douthat's words, quote, Israel is a kind of enemy of convenience for a left-wing worldview that otherwise lacks real-world correlates for its theories. Intent on finding enemies, but discovering more of them in the past than the present, the students fasten on Israel with a sense of excited vindication, a spirit that yields easily to hate, end quote. In other words, hostility to Israel is a form of Selma envy, or in this case, what we might call apartheid envy. The intersectional coalition can't hang together unless the sins of the colonial past are somehow proven to be present today. Israel is Western, powerful, and at war with non-Western countries, so it seems to supply the needed confirmation. What was comedy in the case of Father McPeak turns to tragedy when the target, villainized in ignorance, is the Jewish state. Of course, Jews, rather than being so-called settler colonialists, have been a presence in Israel since before Islam existed. Islam, in its turn, overthrew and replaced the Christian Byzantine Empire. From the river to the sea, Byzantium will be free, might be a more appropriate slogan. But of course, the Byzantine Christians are gone, massacred, forcibly converted, or fled westward after the fall of Constantinople. It appears that some settler colonialists are more efficient than others. Now, I could go on about all the other reasons that Israel makes a very bad substitute for the great Western empires of old, from the Holocaust to Israel's own struggle against the British Empire in the course of founding its modern state. But let me instead touch on one more reason for the intersectional coalition's hostility toward the Jews. The Jews are an American success story, not simply in the sense of being prosperous, but also of being patriots. Third world politics has become a substitute for the third world cultures that immigrants and their descendants left behind long ago. As I've argued, this was true of Edward Said, the founder of what's called post-colonial theory. How many people have heard of Said? Okay, a fair number. Said was a Palestinian raised as a Christian and forbidden to speak Arabic in a colonial-style school. When he moved to America to finish his schooling, he actually avoided Middle Eastern immigrants because he had so little in common with them. Said found his Middle Eastern identity belatedly through politics. He became the great American advocate of the Palestinian cause and the foremost critic of Israel. Said serves as a prototype of the highly westernized intersectional minorities who get back their ethnic credentials by turning against the West, in politics at least, if not in the way they conduct their daily lives. Okay, so is there a way to return our colleges and universities to the study of the history and great works of Western civilization? Yes, there is. It's called the General Education Act, model state-level legislation that I co-authored along with Jenna Robinson of North Carolina's Martin Center for Academic Renewal and David Randall of the National Association of Scholars. The General Education Act does three big things. First, it establishes a robust set of requirements that all students must take to graduate, putting American history, civics, and the story of Western civilization at the center of that program. The public's representatives, whether a board of governors or a legislature, have always had the power to mandate a program of general education for public universities. In practice, the decision usually remains at the level of trustees. And trustees, or in North Carolina, governors, generally rubber stamp whatever the faculty decides. But governors and legislators do have the authority to determine a program of general education on their own. In the 1920s, legislatures in half the states mandated by statute that courses on the Constitution be offered at public universities. And half of those states established courses on the Constitution as graduation requirements. These laws are still well enforced in at least a few states, for example, Texas. Now, South Carolina's 1920s vintage law establishing the study of the Constitution as a graduation requirement was poorly enforced for decades. Recently, however, the state revived and modified the old law and got agreement that public universities would enforce it. This is the REACH Act, if you've heard of it, the South Carolina REACH Act. The choice between graduation requirements in critical race theory, gender and sexuality, and environmental sustainability on the one hand, and Western civilization, traditional American history and civics on the other, is not primarily a question of academic expertise. At base, it's a question of values, and that is why the people's representatives rightly have a determinative voice on general education requirements. All the legislature has to do is to exercise its prerogative, rather than simply rubber stamping the decisions of a heavily politicized faculty. Now, the second big thing the General Education Act does is to establish an independent school of general education to teach the newly required courses. This independent academic unit would also be empowered to hire a substantial number of new faculty members to teach in the new program, faculty committed to classic liberal education. Third, the General Education Act would empower the Board of Governors and/or the Board of Trustees to reduce the existing faculty by an amount equivalent to the new faculty hired. Even tenured professors could be dismissed. Now, that's because the return of classic general education would represent a fundamental change of the university's educational mission and strategy. And in cases where the basic mission of a public university changes, something called program discontinuance is permitted. Program discontinuance. In that case, whole departments can be shut down, even including tenured positions. So the General Education Act is transformative. It means a substantial new curriculum and a substantial new faculty, not for all courses, but for a very substantial number. I would recommend applying the General Education Act not to the entire public system, but to a single campus. In this state, for example, you might apply it to Western Carolina University. Limiting the change to a single campus reduces political pushback and makes it easier to hire new faculty. Once you've got even a single campus offering classic liberal education, parental choice will be restored. Students will flock there, encouraged by parents who want a classic education for their children. Selectivity will rise. The General Education Act doesn't mandate specific books, only general categories like Homeric epic or ancient Greek tragedy. The exception is the Bible. The required course in Western humanities must include substantial selections from both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, which returns us to our larger theme. The Bible, whether read as a testament of faith or as a cultural and literary masterpiece, is a blank page to far too many students. And as we've seen, the current generation wouldn't recognize the intellectual legacy of the West if it was eating frozen yogurt right in front of them. What to make of this ignorance? Classic liberal democracy is the pride and triumph of the West. We achieved it by paring back the reach of any one religion or denomination and by disentangling religion from a range of social institutions. Individual freedom was the result, and surely that freedom must be cherished and protected. Yet our greatest problem today may lie in the opposite direction. Religion is disappearing. Individual choice, at least in some cases, seems to have been elevated above social and even biological reality. In a farewell address that Americans used to memorize in school for civics, George Washington reminded us that religion and morality are the indispensable supports of political prosperity. Have we lost those supports? Or worse, is a persecuting secular religion taking up the space left by the retreat of traditional religion and morality? All of this can and should be argued. There's no simple answer, and people will naturally disagree on what to do or whether there's even a problem in the first place. But without knowing where we've been and how we got to be who we are, we won't even be able to have an intelligent disagreement about the dilemmas of our day. Our past supplies us with tools to make sense of our present. We are Western, whether we know it or not, and whether some of us want to admit it or not. Know thyself was the maxim famously inscribed on the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece, a phrase pondered ever after in the Western tradition by the likes of Cicero, Aquinas, John Calvin, Kant, Hegel, and beyond. If we want to flourish as a society, we had best take the oracle's message to heart. Thank you.